We are excited that you all four are here and that you said yes to our invitation for this panel, in which we will look for useful insights from previous Stadsgevoel events for today's topic, negotiating about objects of heritage in settings where action is needed as well. And I wondered, may we conclude from your positive response that you are interested in the further development of emotion networking, or maybe in Kempering, or maybe you said yes because you are interested in this neighborhood, or maybe you said yes for another reason. Anita, can I give you briefly the floor? Oh, you have your own mic, I think. Yeah.
Is it working? Yes. Yeah. I'm working with post-65 architecture and urban design, and I think this surrounding is a special attention for us, also because I think diversity of the society is very influential for talking about post-65 architecture and urban design. So I'm very interested in the discussion about it.
Thank you. And Gloria?
Well, I would say all of the above, and also because I live in this neighborhood, so I'm a stakeholder, I would say.
Great. That's the first time we hear this word, stakeholder. There are many stakeholders here, I think, today. Thank you. Dyoñna.
Well, because I think that heritage is very influenced by changes in the modern society. And I believe that the emotion networks can contribute to these changes and to let us view these changes in a critical perspective. Yeah.
Well, the first reason is that the firework disaster and the Bijlmer disaster are very comparable. So that's the first reason why I said yes, I will come to the first discussion. And now I think not only those disasters, but the discussion in the first meeting was about when do you collect heritage, material or immaterial, and Kempering is also an example, and I'm very interested in it.
Great, wonderful. So already you got some sneak preview, at least you know now that there have been previous sessions here, and the situation is that in the audience there are several people who have been here before and who have been attending previous sessions, but there are also people who are maybe here for the first time. Who is here for the first time? Yeah. So I think that you want to know what happened before. And you also might want to know what is this emotion networking thing that people are talking about. So let me briefly, because before I give the floor to our guests, share what I think has been discussed so far in general, and then we come back and can have a discussion and look what we take from the previous sessions for today's session. Approaching something as heritage, as a thing from a past that carefully should be dealt with in the present in order to hand it over to future generation, is a cultural practice in which diverging interests and feelings are involved. For those who feel emotionally engaged in heritage negotiations, it is not just about the item of heritage. There is more at stake. Quality of life is at stake. And emotion networking is a new way of making the dynamics in interactions around objects of heritage that are so important more transparent by bringing people's feelings and emotions at the negotiation table. Our ultimate aim is to help people to make sense of the complex, networked heritage dynamics and to gain awareness of the interrelatedness of things. Emotion networking is an idea and a practical method still in development. And some of you might have already been introduced to this idea and method here at Imagine IC or at the Reinwardt Academy, maybe during a lecture or workshop or training or somewhere else. Imagine IC and the Reinwardt started organizing exploratory research events about heritage making and emotions as early as 2012. The first series of events took place under the title Intangible Cultural Heritage with POP, PRIK, and the follow-up program was called Stadsgevoel, the sense of the city, the feel of the city, featuring episodes in 2017 and 2018. Now, for the Feel of the City series, we selected items of which we thought it might be worth to bring people with their feelings, emotions, and interests in all their diversity and uniqueness together to share, and through this to explore whether this sharing would lead to a sense of connectivity, to new connections. We selected different sorts of items: a car park, a monument in commemoration of the abolition of slavery, objects related to the airplane crash in the Bijlmer, Zwart Beraad, an activist movement. And for each session, we brought different questions to the floor. Like, what does the item brought up for conversation do to you? And do your feelings and emotions change when others, on invitation, share their feelings with you? Are you moved by the tears of others? And then, do all emotions count? And do all count at the same time? Do they all have the same weight? Can someone being touched by other people become a spokesperson of these other people? We struggled. What is an emotion? Our answer to that question was, emotions are feelings made social. Did we come to a better understanding of how to recognize, how to acknowledge these feelings? Or do we know now how to document them? We struggled. Is it a good idea to focus so much on emotions now, these days, now that we seem to live in an age of alternative facts? We think it is important, exactly because of this, to talk about emotions and how they matter in daily interactions. We asked ourselves, what is heritage? When an object becomes part of an institutional collection, we think it doesn't necessarily work like this. We think the continuous negotiation is what makes an item significant, not the fact that it can be found somewhere in a collection. But institutions do matter indeed in the process of heritage making, including Imagine IC. How do these institutions matter? Gloria, Erik, Dyorna, and Anita, you have all been active in one of the previous editions. Anita, you were the one of the speakers in our very first edition when we talked about car park Kempering. Gloria, you shared with us your thoughts and emotions when we talked about the slavery monument. And Erik, you participated in a conversation about things that reminded us of the Bijlmer flight disaster. And Dyorna, you were there when we discussed Zwart Beraad. It would be great if you all could reflect on the previous sessions and share with us your thoughts on what you think are relevant things to keep in mind during our conversations today. And I thought it would be good to structure our conversation a bit, tight structure. This means that we can spend some time on each session. We started in 2016 with the car park Kempering as our first case. And different emotions came to the fore, feelings of regret, feelings of nostalgia, feelings of pride. And people seemed to be touched by feelings of others. Maybe as a result of that, the car park is still there. A decision still has to be made. Anita, you were there at the very first meeting, and I would love to hear from you how you look back to that day. with all these emotions. But if you allow me, I give you some time to think about your feelings and the things you want to take with you, while now first going back to the second seminar in June 2017. And I will come back to you later, Anita. This second seminar focused on the National Monument in remembrance of the abolition of slavery in Oosterpark. Again, many emotions. The question we brought up then was, do all emotions count when we discuss heritage, when we make heritage? Do all emotions count, including the ones that come into being during our conversation? And Gloria, that time you said, yes, all emotions count and it is important to acknowledge them all. Can you maybe reflect on that a bit more?
Yes, I remember saying that. And I have since been thinking that even though I stand by that, I think lots of more work will be necessary to bring out emotions with white people, in white people, because they may be there, maybe they are unconscious, but there is an asymmetrical situation going on. When we look at the Afro-Surinamese population, we have inherited all kinds of narratives, stories from our ancestors about slavery. So we know about it. We know what it meant for our ancestors to live through slavery, to not become dehumanized in a dehumanizing system. So we have all kinds of knowledge and emotions about that. On the other hand, with the white population, that knowledge has consciously been kept away from white people. It is not taught in schools. If you are lucky, you get it in university a little bit. You can take a minor, some courses in the Dutch expansion, as it is called in Leiden. We are not treated in an equal fashion as far as important traumas in Dutch history. We know about the Holocaust. We hardly know anything about slavery. So though I think it is important that there is room for all emotions, I think we should problematize what kinds of emotions are possible for white people especially, but not exclusively, when the knowledge is severely lacking. So I want to make a connection to education at all kinds of levels and to be cognizant of the asymmetry, the asymmetrical situation that we are dealing with. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yes, and I remember that you also said it's not that easy because we have maybe find a new way of how to discuss this, how to bring this at the table, and maybe sometimes find a new language, find new words, or find new ways of how to address this asymmetrical relation. And then there is one sort of concept, one idea that's coming back, this idea of intersectionality that might be helpful for us. Can you sort of share with us a bit of and explain again what is this idea that could help us, this idea of intersectionality, maybe also in educational programs and yeah.
Well, but before I get there, I want to point out that the situation is very complex. So apart from lack of knowledge, a lack of value that we collectively ascribe to this history of slavery, there is also a widespread feeling on the part of mostly white people, well, what do I have to do with that history? You know, I didn't have ancestors who were slaveholders. It's not my business. So that again points to the necessity to critically look at our national self-image and how that has been deposited in each of us. So it has to do with education, and I'm firmly convinced that the concept of intersectionality, which should start at a very young age, I think already at primary school level, we should teach children about how our positions are influenced by a combination of how we are positioned in society. So we occupy positions in society on the basis of our gender, of our race, ethnicity, class, maybe sexuality, and a combination of those things. So I am not very equipped to tell you how to do that at primary school age, but there are other people who can do that. The idea is that we need to learn how to self-reflect, how to do self-reflection, because that will help us later on in when we have to reflect on what that history of slavery has to do with each one of us. So intersectionality is a way of thought that brings together different elements, whereas now, in traditional thought, something either has to do with gender, or with race, ethnicity, or with class, but not with all of them at the same time. So I'm convinced that will help us. It will have to start at a very young age, so that these channels of affect and emotion, which also should be there for white people, can be opened up.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to check with the audience. So this idea of intersectionality, can we sort of work with that? And are there urgent questions? People will say, no, still I need another. Is that clear for the moment? Yeah? So because I think it's a relevant concept also to connect it to this idea of emotion networking, because it can help us to highlight connections, connections between the different issues and different aspects of life. And I also remember that you said it's important then to sort of find a way to talk about feelings, emotions, to make them to have them on the table, because in that sense it can also, and it will also change our thoughts, and our thoughts change when you and our emotions change when you talk about them, and so there might be an emotion shift. And in that sense I wanted to sort of move on to the second seminar, it was the third, when we discussed and we talked about the Bijlmer flight disaster, the airplane crash, and we invited you, Erik, then to share your experiences as a museum professional after the firework disaster in Enschede. And one of the questions we discussed then was talking about these emotion shifts and how maybe talking about emotions, what is the role of object, of things in that conversation. So we brought to the table different objects, small, very private, precious objects, but also one item, a fragment of the airplane that crashed that day in the Bijlmer. And what do these objects do to us? And how can they help us maybe to look for connections? And how can they help us in the conversation? Can you take us back to that session and reflect on that a bit?
I will try. My first remembrance was a very, in my opinion, a theoretical discussion about when is an object heritage. Because from a museum view, you can say we call it heritage when it's in the house, when it's in the museum and collected and described and so on. But in my opinion, objects are very heritage when they tell a story and when they when people have emotions with that object, because it's a model for what's happened. And there was also a discussion. We had an exhibition, and we invited 10 victims of the firework disaster who had, who they hadn't anything left. Their houses were disturbed, and they had just one object left. Another one had 5 objects. And they gave them to our museum for the exhibition, but they wanted to have back afterwards because it was very important for them. And Noralie Bayer, who presented the session, she wondered, why do you give them back and why don't you keep them in your museum? And I said, it's logical to give them back. It's heritage, but their heritage, it's their feelings. And you can collect it maybe later on when people died. Children don't like to have it anymore, and that was the discussion, I think. And so I learned. It was my opinion, but I learned stronger than before that heritage is more than just what we have in the museum.
Yeah, because that came up. That, of course, the car park Kempering, it was not a monument. It was not built as a monument. And then we moved on to the monument for the abolition of slavery, to commemorate the abolition of slavery. That was built as a monument. And then these items, these precious items that are kept sometimes in private houses, they are not sort of heritage yet, or maybe they are, and people think what to do with it. And it is also, we then asked, by turning them or by labeling them as heritage, or by making them part of a national collection, is that enough as a sort of acknowledgement of the pain and the acknowledgement of the of what happened for people? And I remember that some people said, yes, it does happen. It is relevant. It is important that these objects become, at a certain moment, part of the national collection, part of the Rijksmuseum or the Amsterdam Museum, or in your case, Enschede. So if you give back these objects to people, they are out of the museum again. So how to deal with this idea that the institutions do matter?
Well, I think it's good to know where these objects are, where the stories are. You can collect them for such an exhibition, but now it's too early to collect them. But it's important to keep in touch with those people. And maybe later on you can collect them in your museum, and you can do investigation in the neighborhood. Are there more stories? And open your door and open your window to invite people to tell about it, and to bring some ideas how you can make such a collection bigger.
Yeah. So it's about collecting items and putting them and integrating them in a museum collection and bringing them out again and collecting stories. Gloria, is that for you sort of enough, or would it? How do you feel about sort of, keeping objects and bring them in collection and collecting stories? Or how do you feel about that in terms of addressing feelings and emotions, the role of objects?
I have to think about that, whether I'm knowledgeable enough to say something about that. It seems to me very important to collect objects, to make them. I'm reminded of the Cabra mask that was made a number of years ago, which is accompanying the ceremonies and rituals on July 1st, the day when we commemorate the abolition of slavery. It's a beautiful new mask. It's an invented tradition, so I'm very much taken by this idea that it doesn't necessarily have to be old objects, but you can also invent new objects to commemorate something that has been very meaningful in people's lives. So you make new narratives.
New narratives and new objects. And Erik, have there been new objects maybe made after the Enschede firework disaster, and that are now sort of maybe made even on purpose for the museum or for rituals, or apart from, because people had lost everything or not?
There are people who have lost everything,
Yeah.
yes, but I don't know, what do you mean by new?
Maybe objects that really, maybe artists have been asked to make an object in commemoration of the disaster, or...
Okay, that has happened 1 year after the disaster.
Mm-hmm.
There was a big exposition through the whole city, made all artwork by artists inspired by the firework disaster. But nowadays, I don't think they've put a lot of energy in rebuilding the neighborhood, the houses, and so on. And I think it's done very in a very new way, mm-hmm. With a big participation of the people. So, and I think maybe that's a new way of attacking problems.
Yeah.
In the first session, there was a question: how do you go on now? And because we made in 2010 that exhibition, and the objects were given back to the people, as said, and that was it. And there's now an initiative by the regional paper, the local government, our museum, and supported by a bureau who has as a goal to promote social participation, to interview, to collect oral history, and when there are objects, it's nice to support the stories. To make another exhibition in 2020, and I think we will give that a better follow-up than we did in 2010.
Yeah. Okay.
And
continuous projects,
yes.
New project, new ideas, new ways of working. And if I may,
I want to say what I discovered in 2010 that an exhibition is a very good method, has been a very good method to let people think about, reflect on their own experiences. And it helped to, wat is verwerken in het Engels?
Healing, or
for the healing, to give it the place. I think it never heals, but you can give it the place in your heart, in your mind.
Yeah.
And the exhibition was a very good method for it. And I think to do it again, we should see that effect of it.
Yeah. So objects do matter, and that is maybe something that to keep in mind when we move on to the fourth and last Stadsgevoel series or Stadsgevoel event. Dyorna, you were there then when we brought at a table not an object but an activist movement. So you might say intangible heritage. The activist movement Zwart Beraad. and that was a movement. Maybe you can explain a bit. What was it?
Okay, I will try to explain it short. Zwart Beraad was a movement after there were certain promises that were made for the Bijlmer, for the developments in the Bijlmer, and then from the European Commission offered 26 million euros to spend on these developments. And there were people from the Bijlmer, but they were politicians, and they were like, okay, but we want to help the European Commission. We want to decide where the money were spent. Yeah. Yes. And so then they came up with Zwart Beraad, and there were lots of things going on because they didn't get the space to do everything that they wanted to do with the Bijlmer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So now you are saying this, and you were not part of Zwart Beraad. You are a younger generation, and one of the things we discussed that day was who can be a spokesperson or who can be a representative of a movement like this, or maybe of an event, or maybe of an history, who has the sort of the right to appropriate this history. And I remember that the atmosphere in the audience was really like, okay, sometimes you have to conclude that it's only the ones who were there then and who took part in the movement who have the right to really talk and feel and share emotions, and that's it. How do you feel as a younger generation, and how do you think back to that event?
Well, first of all, I think that everybody has a voice to they have a voice to say something about Zwart Beraad. Because you can also see at the event, only the people who were members of the Zwart Beraad were sitting on the bench. And at that point, when we were not ready for questions from the audience, someone from the audience stood up. And he was like, okay, when can I talk? Where is my voice? When can I say something? And that's very important to think about, because it's not only the Zwart Beraad, but it's also the organizations who were working with the Zwart Beraad. It's also the residents in the Bijlmer. It's also people who were connected. So there you can also see the different connections from these different emotions. So yeah, it's for everybody. Everybody has a voice to say something about Zwart Beraad and the developments around Zwart Beraad.
So even if people who were there and who were touched by the others, by the emotions that were there, and who think, okay, now I'm one of them, or can you become even one of them, one of the movement, or?
Do you mean that if somebody who was not a resident, someone who was?
Yeah.
Well, I personally don't think so. Well, we have to look at, okay, what was your betrokkenheid?
What was your involvement, and
yes.
how active have you been? Yeah.
Yes, what was your involvement? Because if you have nothing to do with it, and if you're only somebody who were listening everything, who was following everything, then what was your involvement into these emotions around the problem with Zwart Beraad?
But then we have an issue, because all these heritage professionals, sometimes they are involved, sometimes they are not involved, and sometimes these heritage professionals decide on things and speak for other people. And maybe in the case of Kempering, that might happen, that at the end of the day, the government, helped by heritage professionals, take a decision. So again, there is this question of, how about this top-down, bottom-up sort of dynamics? Anita, I know that you struggle with this issue as heritage professionals now that they are no longer the expert, and other people want to be involved as well. And you were there at the very first event when we talked about Kempering, and you said then, yes, I want to acknowledge all these feelings, all emotions, they are relevant. It's relevant to show that they are relevant. And now, where are you now as a professional?
I'm still struggling, but what was the item then? Who decides what is cultural heritage? And must we use only objective criteria, or can we use also subjective meanings? And I think cultural heritage, and I told that cultural heritage started with subjective items and with anger, because in the 19th century town walls were torn down, and it was a group of people who started to say that that was not a good thing to do, and that we should maintain those town walls, because it told something about our heritage and our culture. So later we made it more objective, and we made it a discussion between architectural historians. But in fact, cultural heritage is part of all of the people, and I think we should go back to that, and especially because our society is getting more diverse, and everybody must be heard. And what was very important at that time, at that meeting, that the Kempering was also a church for people from Ghana. And what struck me very much, that was told that everybody in Ghana knows 2 addresses in the Netherlands, the house where they live and the address of Kempering too. That's struck me.
Yeah, and so that is important to acknowledge. But do you have a sort of method now that helps you to sort of in the way of coming to a decision or making a decision, or did maybe the discussion help you, or do we need another day to see if we can sort of get to that method?
What I told, I'm still struggling, but I think we have to listen to stories. And we, 2 weeks ago, we had a monument congress in Amersfoort, and that was mostly professionals. And I asked those people the question, who should decide what is cultural heritage? Is that a thing that professionals need to decide? Is it the civil society that needs to decide, or is it a combination of both? And 95% of the people said that it was a combination of professionals and civic society that should decide if a thing or a building or something else should be cultural heritage.
Yeah.
And I think that has changed already.
Yeah. So it's a combination, but then still, how to sort of combine the two, how to work together, the professionals and citizens, with all these emotions, with all these feelings, and especially the question also might be, and that is the question of today, one of the questions, how to, once a decision has been made, how to continue this negotiation process. Do you have a clue, or?
No, only thing that I'm sure of, that a cultural heritage is dynamic. So we should, every time we should discuss what is cultural heritage and what we do with it.
Yeah.
And I think professionals can help to understand the historical context, but they must listen also to the people and listen to news stories about it.
Yeah. So for today, we hope that since you are such a diverse and large audience, that we might collect again new stories about Kempering, and maybe even keep collecting them after a decision has been taken. But now maybe in the audience there are a couple of minutes for 3 minutes. 3 minutes, great. For questions, maybe to the speakers, and yes. Shall I walk over, or is there a mic? Yeah.
Thank you. Norton Flores Troche, I work for the municipality here. I think the problem is very complex because are emotions involved, are people involved, are objects involved. And I think situations in which the whole society is involved, and there are others that is very personal. So I think what this is playing a role is the scale that we are talking about. And the scale, I think, is important. For example, in the problem from slavery, maybe the scale is the whole society. And some people probably were more involved. Black people, slavery, were more involved. And some will deny that we're involved. But I think the problem should be taken of that level. When we talk about Kempering, probably somebody from Haarlem or somebody from Groningen will not be in touch with that. So it's another type of scale. And if we talk about objects, personal objects, so it's also another type of scale. So I think the emotions that are involved should be taken in each level and discussed of that levels. Otherwise, we will mix everything together. And I think it's very important to define which people was involved, from who is coming the emotions, and they were part of the problem or not.
Yes, thank you. Relevant remark. So you're sort of stressing the fact that we need to focus sometimes, focus on very specific events, and in other cases try to lift it up and connect it maybe to bigger events, or how do these small events relate to bigger issues also. Even I think maybe the Bijlmer disaster, the grief and the pain and the feeling of not being acknowledged, that was something that was shared with the people maybe that were sort of suffering after the Enschede fireworks disaster. And Gloria, you just took your mic back and oh, okay. Yeah.
I think it doesn't matter if you are involved or not. When you are involved, you have your emotions, but other people can learn of those emotions. And I think that's the worth of the value of heritage, and maybe also the reason to collect it in a professional institution, that you lift it from the personal situation to a common situation. When you discuss about Kempering in Groningen, they can learn what kind of emotions are connected to building, otherwise than the architectural value of it. They can learn about it. When they look at the situation in the Bijlmer with the flight disaster and the firework disaster in Enschede, you can learn about the role of the government in it. Yeah. And that's the value of the emotions and the objects, the stories of the people, but you have to take it to another scale, what you are talking about.
Yeah.
And I think that should be the connection.
Yeah, thank you. Dyorna?
I think we also need to look at, we're talking about involvement, but in what scale? Just like I said, what skill of involvement? If you put a heritage professional, we as heritage professionals, we have a responsibility to tell the story how it is, but with the help of others. So if you put a heritage professional in the center or a curator, you also need to look at the involvement of the curator. But if the curator is not involved, then it's her responsibility, or her, no gender, responsibility to involve other people who were involved.
Yeah, thank you. Both very relevant remarks, and I think this is also the core issue that is at stake when we want to develop this idea of emotion networking further, that we learn from each other and that it might help us to think in terms of networks or intersectionality, to look for new connections and to look how things are related and even how our position shifts when we learn from each other and hear each other's stories or share emotions. So I hope that we can take all your thoughts and reflections and that you take with us the rest of the day, and that we now have a bit better idea what happened before today in the series of Stadsgevoel. We now have a brief coffee break, and then Stephanie will take over. And there is time to walk over there. There's the coffee, and to have a look at the Kempering exhibition. Yeah. After 10 minutes. Yeah.